pulse of the background screening industry. Brought to you by iCubed Advisors.
Welcome back to the iCubed podcast, where we explore the ideas, innovations, and people shaping the future of the background screening industry. I'm your host, Nick Fishman. In this episode, we're taking a closer look at the recent PBSA Europe Summit held last week in Paris, a gathering that brought together industry leaders, privacy experts, and background screening professionals from across the continent to discuss emerging trends, regulatory developments, and global opportunities. Joining me today is someone who's no stranger to these conversations, iCube's own Andy Hellman, a respected industry veteran and a keen observer of international screening dynamics. Andy attended the summit and is here to share his firsthand insights, what stood out, what surprised him, and what it all means for those of us navigating the future of screening on both sides of the Atlantic. So, Andy, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Excited to talk to you.
Absolutely. Well, before we get started, I just wanted to mention that the audio version of this podcast is available at Background Checks Radio, which can be found on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. So, Andy, let's jump in. Let's start with the big picture. What were your overall impressions of the conference? Were there any notable shifts in tone or focus compared to prior events?
Yeah, I'll correct one thing that you said about across the continent. One thing that's noticeable about this conference was how international it was, and I say that probably should say intercontinental. Even with Europe, it's obviously international, but a number of people from APAC region were there. We had a really good turnout from the U.S. I think we had about a dozen people from the U.S. show up. So out of a conference, it was a little under 100 people, a decent number of people from outside of their Europe region as well, which is really cool to see. But I always encourage people to go to these when they can. It's so different than a US conference. I don't know if it was when we were talking about this podcast prior, kind of being a little bit old school back to the early days of PBSA, when you got a bunch of people in a room just kind of hanging out and talking, because at the Europe conference, at the APAC conference, at the Canada conference, because they're smaller, you don't have all these different tracks. There's not breakout sessions and people going different ways and, 5 different vendor parties going on each night and stuff like that. So it is all 100 people in the same room together doing the same sessions all day long and then going to the same event that evening. So it's such a different feel when you're all doing the same stuff. You're not kind of running in 10 different directions. You really get a chance outside of every event, every session, everybody's in the same breakout space. So you're chatting with everybody and it's just a very different feel to it. Because of that, I think there's a lot of energy that's really cool to see at it. It's really cool to be able to talk to almost everybody that's there. And I mean, there's no way you can go talk to 800 people at an annual conference in any meaningful way, other than, checking your passport as you go through all the booths or whatever, trying to get the prize. But at these
Right, and you nailed it. It is just exactly what PBSA used to be like in the very early days, and that's what made it so special for so long.
Yep. Yeah, that's the cool thing. It's kind of old school. And it's fun to go to them. It's really enjoyable.
Yeah. So tell me some of the themes that kind of dominated the conversation in Paris. What were your observations?
Yeah, I mean, in the sessions themselves, it was a really wide variety of stuff from AI to compliance and regulatory, some country specific, talking about South Africa and what goes on in South Africa. So there's a really big mix of stuff in terms of the content of what's happening. But the one thing that really struck me that was really interesting about this was talking to people on the sidelines, talking to people running organizations in Europe. Up until very recently, UK was a pretty saturated market, a lot of background screening. That's where most of the big companies were. But talking about the critical mass starting to happen in these other countries, in France, in Germany, there's a background screening company from Sweden there, Dutch company there. So all these other markets outside of UK and Europe starting to see more critical mass of screening, starting to see that uptick of the market there. And not just driven by US multinationals that have a market presence, say you got a background screen everywhere, but the local companies, the local economy starting to adapt background screening. That was really interesting to see and something that's different than anything I've heard prior conferences.
Yeah, and I mean, I think over the years we've seen that the concept of a background check for a long time over there seemed to be very taboo, and it sounds like they are certainly have a mind shift in the importance of security and making sure they're protecting their vulnerable populations. Um, I, on the global front, global compliance and cross-border screening have always been extremely complex. It's one thing in the United States where you deal with, for the most part, one set of rules. But tell me, from a European standpoint or a worldwide version, did you hear anything new on any regulations or background screening firms that are approaching data protection, GDPR, or evolving AI regulations in any special way?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, kind of thinking about that, our US conferences, we always have so many sessions on compliance, right? There's always a keynote or a general session on the latest updates and things like that. It almost seems like in Europe that it's just part of everything. You don't have to have all these separate sessions talking about GDPR and GDPR compliance. Not that it doesn't happen. And there was one session, a panel discussion, and one of the panel members was one of the regulators from CNIL, which is the French regulator. Don't ask me to tell you what it stands for. It's CNIL. It was really interesting listening to him talk and give some firsthand thoughts and feedback on some of the things that we do in the industry. It was great. But at the end of the day, I think that it's just more accepted. Yeah, we have regulation, we work through it. Maybe because you're not threatened by lawsuits left, right, and center in the U in Europe like we are in the US. But they spend a lot less time worrying about the regulations and a lot more time worrying about the business, which I think is a good thing.
And just now, the bells started ringing in plaintiffs' councils all over the world, as you mentioned that. Um, Europe tends to be the leader when it comes to privacy regulation. Do you see any trends or initiatives discussed at the summit that U.S. background screeners should be paying close attention to?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't so much a session or a big trend being discussed, but the one thing I actually did after the panel discussion with the French regulator, privacy attorney that works for one of the firms that's very active in global privacy issues, puts out a good newsletter. Just kind of chatting after that, and I won't attribute any specific quotes or anything to folks that may have been speaking more in a personal capacity, but right now, one of the big things that lets us do what we do with background screening is transferring data from Europe over to the US. We do it under the data privacy framework frequently. It's not the only way to do it, but that's often what's used. And with some of the changes that have happened with the new administration, there's been some talk that maybe data privacy framework will not last. There'll be a challenge to it. And there seemed to be a view that will indeed happen. That at some point in time, data privacy framework will come down, just like Safe Harbor did, like Privacy Shield did before it. That there will be a challenge and it will not last. And so, I think it's something for U.S. companies to be very aware of and to be prepared for, because if this does happen, you're going to have to find a way to legitimize data flows from Europe to the U.S. In a different way. And there are ways to do it, but you're going to have to be ready for that.
Yeah. And I think, generally here in the US, we've started to hear CRAs talk about, kind of leveling off in terms of business. Are you hearing the same things among the attendees that were there last week?
No, actually, I got the impression from companies that things were going strong, to actually doing pretty well. And I think that this is the difference when, you're going into new markets or markets that aren't saturated, right? Because if you're in a saturated market, unless the economy is going well, the net business is the same.
Yep.
But if you're in a new market, bringing on customers that maybe haven't background screened before, the market can grow even if the economy is going down. And I'm not saying the economy is going down there, but the point being the dynamics are different. And so I think that's the thing that's really interesting and exciting across Europe is right now, as some of these economies starting to take on background screening, with there being more of an understanding, and there was some talk about potential regulations that would put the onus on companies to background screen. In the US, we have the negligent hiring doctrine, which says if you don't background screen somebody and they mess up, you're liable.
Yep.
Really exists quite the same way in Europe yet, but there was talk about some regulations coming out that could change that mindset. And so that's the exciting thing about Europe is even if the economy, even if there's some level of stagnation or even some recession, doesn't mean that the market can't be growing over there right now.
Yep. Yeah. And look, we've all lived through it. For those of us that have been in this industry for a very long time, when it is a fairly new concept or a concept that only certain segments of the economy are running background checks, and all of a sudden it becomes widespread. There's a lot of green space there for a lot of time. So hopefully that's a sign of things to come in Europe and internationally. Um, you've now been to several PBSA events across different regions, and you mentioned the intimacy of this conference. Are there any other unique perspectives that this particular conference offers that you don't typically see elsewhere?
Yeah, I think that the non-US conferences, by virtue of the companies that are showing up for the most part, um, you've got the CEO, you've got the decision makers in there because they're smaller companies. I mean, if you
Yeah,
look at even if you take out, First Advantage, HireRight, the big 3 or 4 or 5 companies out of the US, if you look at the average size, average revenue of a US background screening company compared to non-US, it's a lot larger. So you've got all the different people, all the different functions there, and what who shows up to a conference might be a very different subset. It's not always the decision makers, not always the CEOs in the US that are going to the conferences. Outside the US, the majority of the people there, I would say, certainly most people I'm talking to are a CEO, they're an owner, a founder, or a high level exec because the organizations are smaller and flatter, which is really just a different dynamic that you've got all these people there that are really the decision makers that are driving the industry, what's going to happen, what products are taking on, and things like that. So I think it changes the dynamic a lot for that. Um, the big companies don't always have as much presence, even at the US conferences, I guess, maybe sometimes. But the people there all tend to be fairly high level, the people that have a lot of influence in what's happening in the organizations.
that's great. And one of the things that you told me about, and I don't want to forget, you were talking a lot about the approach to ID validation over there, and certainly I think we've seen kind of a lag in adoption here in the US. What did you find out being over there?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that's interesting. And I'm gonna give away my ending here on this potentially. But I think in the US, we think, background screening started here, right? It was a US idea and it's slowly spreading out to the rest of the world. And so therefore, the US is always in the lead in background screening, and what we do
Yeah,
here eventually filters out, which is true to a certain extent. And I think we see that in how things behave in the US. I hear it actually enunciated out loud outside the US. Oh, well, the US does this and we're all going to follow that. But there are some things by virtue of not being saddled with the way things have always been done, the way things have always happened, that the non-US markets are going to be leading on certain things. If you look at digital ID, that's something that you don't see as much in the US, right? We'll use credit header data to match up a name and address, date of birth, or things like that. Say, it looks like the person, but how do you know it's really Andy or just somebody who's got Andy's information on the other end? Eventually maybe you get to an I-9 process here in the US, but outside the US, there's much more prevalence with doing digital ID verification. It was one of the things that came up. One company said they find almost 10% of the IDs that they check are fake. And I actually had
that's
this
a big
conversation.
number. Repeat that one again. I want to make sure it sinks into
Almost 10%,
yeah.
10% are fake. And I was actually having a conversation with one of my neighbors talking about our teenage kids and pointing out that you can get a fake ID from China now that will actually pass all the kind of numerical checks on the ID document. Stuff will match up. You have a little scan QR code type thing in the back will actually match to the information on the front and stuff like that. Like it's easy to get this stuff now. And so the ways we've been doing things historically may not be sufficient to keep up with the rise of AI and talking about forged diplomas and documents and all this other stuff. Doing what we've done before may not be sufficient. And that's where I think that outside the US may take the lead in this because they're dealing with this a lot more because they don't have all the same structure and historical ways of doing things that we have in the US. So they're creating ways to deal with this stuff that's completely new. In some cases, maybe a lot better.
Yeah, yeah, and I strongly encourage U.S. companies to adopt this. I mean, we've talked about this for years about how easy it is if somebody isn't really paying attention to the actual identification. How easy it is for somebody to mess a background check up, right? All you have to do is put a different date of birth down, which is a very common identifier when it comes to criminal records, and you can mess up an entire background check. We've seen so many examples of that happening.
Yeah.
So I definitely think it's something that needs to be adopted.
Yeah, and you look at the stories you keep on hearing about the North Korean hackers that are posing as developers and getting into U.S. companies and stuff like that. I mean, if you're hiring contractors, you're not doing an I-9 check, then how are you verifying who these people really are? So, there's that. The digital credentials is another one.
Mhm.
Digital credentials, I think, are going to be adopted a lot more widely outside the U.S. before they are in the U.S. Now we've got easy ways, National Student Clearinghouse and the work number and things like that to do some of these checks. But when candidates start getting their own data in their wallet, we're going to have to change how we do business. We're not going to be out and verifying the information. Now we're going to be more aggregating information, being the hub for pulling different wallets, different technology standards together and providing that in a meaningful way to the client. There's another thing actually that came up, kind of triggering, remembering this, that in a number of different conversations or presentations, the need to educate the client on what the information means, right? And then we don't tell a client who to hire. We don't tell them that this precludes them from hiring somebody if we find this record. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be educating them on what results might mean or what they might not mean, what level of confidence you might have with certain things. And so I think that's another thing that came out was the need for client education across the board.
Yep, I agree. All right. So for those who couldn't attend the summit but are kind of navigating some similar challenges, whether it's compliance across borders, entering in new markets, or adapting to evolving standards, how can you support them? What kinds of conversations or projects are you open to helping folks out with right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to talking about the size of companies outside the US. They tend to be smaller. They're not massive organizations with a marketing department and a legal department and an HR department and all these other departments. It just doesn't tend to be, they don't tend to have those resources. Like, they are kind of, it was making me kind of realize this. There's a team from First Advantage. They're a good group, and I'll actually give a shout out. I was pretty impressed. Brett Jardine, who's the counsel at FADV, shows up to these events and sits through all the sessions, which amazes me that, as high up as he is, he still takes the time to try to learn stuff at these conferences, which is great.
Yeah,
But
kudos to him because you're not seeing that from a lot of the larger
no, no,
organizations.
not at all.
Yeah,
No, take a full day and spend this time. But most companies don't have that, right? They don't have an in-house attorney. They're relying on outside counsel, which can get expensive. They're relying on hiring consultants for this or that. And there's a quote I heard once that said, "Everything's been thought of before. The trouble's to think of it again." And the point is that don't reinvent the wheel if you're a smaller company. There are resources out there, and it can be a consultant. You can hire myself or IQ for a project, but PBSA has great resources out there too. You can make contacts through your network in PBSA and just ask a question. You'll be surprised at what answers you'll get. And so the big thing for everybody is just if you're smaller companies, don't try to do it all yourself. Don't try to recreate everything. There's somebody out there that's done it, that's dealt with that problem, that probably has a better way to fix it or to answer it or to solve it than what you might come up with in your own. So I think that's really kind of the push is reach out to the network, if need be, reach out to the consultants in the space. Get somebody in a fractional basis to do some of the roles you might need. You don't need to hire somebody full time for a lot of this, but you probably need somebody who's been there that's learned the hard way some of those mistakes you might otherwise make.
okay, great. Thanks, Andy. That's a wrap on today's episode. A big thank you for sharing your insights from PBSA Europe Summit and helping us better understand the evolving landscaping of global background screening. If you found today's conversation valuable, please be sure to check it out on Background Check Radio. Leave a review and share this episode with your network. And as always, if you have questions or topics you'd like to explore in future episodes, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on iCubed.
Thanks, Nick.